Welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, The Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Malton Gansky, the author of several novels and nonfiction works, including the Harbinger series.
Hooray. I am Molly Jo Reilly. I am producer of the First in Fiction podcast. I am author of the Unemployment Cookbook and the upcoming mystery location novel NOLA.
And a reminder to those of you listening to the audio-only version of this podcast, you can watch us live Tuesday nights at 6:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, where we record via Google Hangouts. And if you add Firsts in Fiction podcast at gmail.com to your circles on Google+, you'll get all those notifications of when we are planning on doing that. So you can join us live and participate in the chat room and ask us questions live and all those types of things, which is a lot of fun. If you are watching on YouTube later, we do ask that you click that thumbs up button if you like what you see and what you hear. That helps us out quite a bit. So, Molly, you always look great, but tonight you're looking a little bit clearer than normal. What might that be? Why might that be?
Well, Aaron, this is your fault.
Oh, it's okay. All right. I'll take that.
My computer was crashing, and through the prayers and blessings of many people, I started a GoFundMe that was completely funded. Went to Best Buy last Friday with your wife, who helped me realize that the computer that I was looking for was not $14.99, but it was $10.99 on sale for $200 off that, plus Naomi had a $100 off coupon. And where I was just going, hoping I would have just enough money to make a down payment or hold it, because I know that this particular model is not going to be around too much longer, I actually walked out of the store with the laptop and a couple of the accessories I need to take care of it. So pretty exciting. And I also got really good internet finally. So
I'm jealous about that, by the way. I'm still jealous.
I'm super excited to be back and producing and be crystal clear online. And boy, you thought I was a social media ninja before. Now wait to see what I can do, because instead of 2 hours to do stuff, it's taking me 20 minutes, and it's so productive already. I'm so excited.
Super nice. I mentioned that because I wanted to thank our listeners. I know several of you were generous enough to make donations to Molly's cause to keep her producing this podcast, because you see what happens when it's just me and Pops, and it's not quite as smooth. So I wanted to say thanks to you guys.
Yeah, I want to say thanks too. I did try to watch the last week's podcast. I got as far as you're running down the little task list that I texted you, so thanks for that. You did well, but my computer just, it would not, the internet in my computer would not play the episodes, so I'm so thankful now I'll be able to go back and watch the older episodes that I've missed. So thank you, Room. Thank you, everybody. This is, I call her Raven. This is my new computer, and I'm just super excited.
Excellent. You named your computer?
I did. But don't frown on me, because guys name their cars, so...
Well, we're talking a car there. That's different.
I'm talking about a way of life. This is...
I just want to note this time and this date on the calendar, because I know eventually, Pops, you will have a name for all of your typewriters, if that has not already happened. So
no, I just have them associated with authors. So...
There you go. Well, that's pretty close. This is my Hemingway.
The Raven is associated with an author. That's why I named her Raven.
Yeah, Hemingway's easy. He had 7 typewriters, different typewriters, and I don't think any of them were identical. So I have a couple models that he used. I don't have his typewriters. That would be worth an awful lot of money. But yeah, he had 7, so you can point at just about any typewriter and say, hey, Hemingway used a typewriter like this. You'd probably be right.
Excellent. Yeah. So, well, we do have an Ask the Author question from Mia Northrup, and she contacted me via aarongansky.com, and she says, I'd like to include some real speeches spoken by politicians in my novel, but edit them for length and paraphrase some of the repetitive parts. What are my responsibilities in declaring that the speeches are not fictitious? And so, Pops, your answer is going to be different than mine, and we talked a little bit about that before the show, and I think it's going to be good to hear the difference, because from a writing standpoint, before I answer, I do want to give a disclaimer that I'm not a lawyer. I don't know much about publishing law or anything like that. I know how to put words on page. I would consider myself pretty educated in the craft of fiction. But beyond that, the production and publication of fiction, not my area of expertise. I usually rely on my publishers for that. And Pops, you've had much more extensive experience in the publishing industry, so your answer is going to be probably a lot more accurate in terms of the publishing law, etc. But my first reaction to this when I read it was, you're probably okay so long as you cite your source. So if this were me, what I would do is I would do as you say. I would include the snippets of the speeches that I want to include. I would make sure that that there's a footnote or that there's some sort of citation, so that the reader understands this is not fictitious. This portion is real, and they can find the original source. You can do that perhaps in an afterword or forward. But the big thing that I would do is mention it to your publisher and say, I've got this in my book. What are our responsibilities in terms of contacting the original publishers or the copyright holders, etc. But my thought process is, in terms of writing it, go ahead and write it, footnote it, cite your sources, and then notify your publisher. That's how I would handle it. But Pops, you know a little bit more about what happens once the publisher has it, and how the rights and responsibilities that they have.
Yeah, when quoting from real people, you always have to be careful. I'll get to that in a second. It looks like really there's two ways we can take this question. One is that she's asking, what is the responsibility in declaring that the speeches are not fictitious? Well, you don't want to break up a novel, pull the reader out by footnoting too much. I only know one author that footnoted his books. That was Michael Crichton. And then when I did a little research, I found out all the footnotes were footnotes supposedly written by his characters, so none of them were real anyway. That was kind of interesting. And so what you suggest here is fine. If that's really the question is, I just want the readers to know that they're not fictitious, that these are from the speeches. Let's say you're going to do Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. It's fairly easy to do. Up front, there's usually a disclaimer about all the characters, other than, say, historical characters, are fictitious, and you don't want to. They don't represent anyone, but you can also, in that area, put in the speeches that follow or drawn from historical text or certain periods of times. I don't know, if you're quoting like a recent candidate or something like that, John McCain back in 2008 or something, you're going to quote one of his speeches. You can just say that up front, or in an afterword, which is what some historical novelists do. They have an afterword that tells you what was real, what was fictitious. But now if the question is the quoting portion of it, can you use it, then that gets really dicey. You have to be careful, and there's probably, if you take 100 people who work in the business, you get 100 different definitions of this. If it's not in public domain and it has not been renewed, which can be done by the estate, a trust, something like that after the author is dead, if it's in public domain, then you can do whatever you want. So I've written a small book about William Jennings Bryant's final speech that was never delivered, and that was given in 1925 and published in 1925. Well, now we're 91 years past that, and I know it's in public domain because I researched it. If it's not in public domain, then you have to be very careful, because if you use it without permission, they can come after you. And if you're going through a traditional publisher, they will go after the publisher and they will go after you, and someplace along the line you're going to have to pay up. So unless it's what's called fair use, which is a small amount of material, and in nonfiction you get away with more because it's educational, but in fiction it's very limited. If you sign a contract with a traditional publisher, then you're very likely to see a clause that puts upon you the onus, the responsibility of getting permission for any quotes that you use or material that you use that's not original to you, and that can get a little dicey to do so. My general rule of thumb is don't quote them, paraphrase them. But if it's important that it be the actual speech that you're using, then you'll either have to get permission from the speech holder. Let's say you pull it out of a famous speeches book. I've got a few of those, and and it could be under the copyright for that book as well as the copyright that the person who first gave this speech may have on it, or his descendants or her descendants, whatever. So anyway, bottom line, be very, very careful. The shorter the document, like a poem or lyrics, the more difficult it is to do a direct quote, because part of fair use is based on a percentage of the whole. And so if you want to quote a particular poem and you use 50% of the poem, you're in violation of the copyright. I don't remember what the exact percentage you're allowed, but it's very difficult to do with poems because you usually only get 1 or 2 lines. Same thing with song lyrics. So I always suggest just being very careful, and if possible, don't do it. And if it's really important, then talk to your publisher.
And we were talking about one of my books that has a snippet of 3 lines of a poem that's got 80 lines in it, and so because of our conversation, I feel like I need to contact my publisher and notify them and make sure that we're covering our bases. Good question, Mia. It's done me well to hear the answer. So.
Well, and the thing to remember is just reverse it. We don't want someone taking a good chunk of our work and putting theirs, and they're profiting off the work that we did without us getting something. So if you're a poet, Aaron, you're a poet. I know nothing about poetry, but you're a poet. If somebody took one of your poems and took 25-30% of it for some reason, doesn't contact you, that's just unprofessional, and in a way it's theft. So you want to do what's right. You want to do what's professional. And then if you're being published traditionally, it can cause all kinds of problems for your publisher. So when it's time to get another book contract, they're going to think twice about it.
And there have been some pretty nasty cases of plagiarism that have developed that did get really ugly financially and all of that. Reputations were destroyed and all that. So, and I know that's not what she's talking about. I know she's not trying to say, like, how much can I, steal and get away with it. She's saying, how do I make sure that I'm doing it properly? So it's a very good question. And I'm glad that you brought it up, and I wish we could give you a little bit more specific advice on the publishing laws, but I think, Pops, what you've offered here is a really good start, really good rule of thumb. So if you're self-published, she chooses to self-publish, go through the same steps, contact the copyright holders and publishers, you'd say?
Yeah, because then you don't even have the safety net of the publisher. Sometimes what they do is if a problem comes up, the publisher will pay whatever the fee is, but they'll take it out of your royalties. And that's all right if it keeps you out of court, but it also means you don't get as much money. So, but if you're self-publishing, you are the publisher. You're the author, you're the publisher, you're the media person, you're all of that. So it all falls on your doorstep. So it is one of the things to be careful of. And it happens almost every year. There's somebody suing somebody over what they will describe as stolen material. But just simple misuse, you just normally get a desist, quit doing this and take out what you already put in. Well, if you've got 10,000 books out there, you can't take them out. You have to recall all of them, which a publisher is not willing to do, or you just have to pay the price. So you really get stuck between a rock and a hard place on that. So it's just better to err on caution. Side of caution.
Yeah, and on that note, I ended up using a photo from Getty Images without realizing it. I'd pulled it from some website, I can't even remember where, and thought it was fair game, and it wasn't. It was copyrighted, and so I had to pay Getty Images and go through the process with them. It was actually fairly easy because they do it all the time, but. Yeah. Found out, I did some research, found out I was actually in error. I took the image down immediately, and you want to make sure that you're protecting yourself. And so I didn't quite take it that seriously. And what's interesting is that the blog post that I put it on had been read like 12 times, and I'm like, was one of the 12 Getty Images? Did they just like how are they finding this? But they do. They have software that will go out and find it. And if you're, quoting from, Barack Obama's most recent speech, and you're doing hashtag Barack Obama all over everything, there's a good chance that the copyright holders are going to know and perhaps come after you if that's the case. So you do want to cover your bases for sure. So CYB, cover your bases.
Yeah, that's a cleaned up version of that, I think.
CYA is cover your assets, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very similar to that. Very similar to that.
So
yeah, and this can happen. And when I was doing Writer's Talk, my podcast, which I would edit and stuff, and I had opening music and opening billboard and all of those kinds of things, and I had to be very careful about that. And I would routinely get notifications from YouTube that you're using copyrighted music and you don't have permission. So finally, I sent him a letter and I said, "Look, I'm getting this. This is royalty-free music that I've taken from my high-end digital editing software. It is not a breach of copyright, and I've never had another comment since. But what it did is it made them go back and look, because it's so automated now that the thing they do is they think, we think maybe they're using our stuff. Let's send them a letter, tell them they owe us money, and it's become a source of income for some groups. So.
Yeah, you gotta watch yourself. You gotta watch yourself. So for sure. Well, let's talk chronology and plot and structure. And this is what we're talking about is the sequence of your events here. So when we talk about chronological structure versus non-chronological, chronological it simply means an order of time, right? It's chronos, time. And so chronological structure is going to be the arrangement of the events in your story or your novel in order in which they happen, say, on a timeline. Okay, first this happened, then this happened, beginning, middle, end. It's pretty straightforward. Pick an example from anything that you've read or any movie that you've seen. Lord of the Rings is in chronological order. Star Wars episodes 4, 5, and 6 are in chronological order. Granted, they went back to do 1, 2, and 3, but that's a whole other mess that we won't deal with right now. But the 4, 5, and 6, chronological order. Misery, the Time Machine. And I actually don't have that in here, and I meant to put it in my notes, so I'll just say it now. All time travel stories are chronological, and it seems counterintuitive because you say, well, wait a minute, they're traveling through time, so it's obviously non-chronological. If the story starts in 2016 and Aaron creates a time machine and goes back to 1812, well, that's clearly non-chronological, right? Actually, no, it's chronological because we're talking about the perspective of the protagonist, right? So in 2016, I build a time machine and I get into it. How old am I? I'm as old as I am right now. And then I travel back in time. How old am I when I get out of that time machine? I'm the same age. I haven't actually gone backward in time. So when we get to the non-chronological structure, really what we're talking about are things. The easiest example is going to be a flashback. Okay, the character is 20 through the majority of your novel, but at one point you've got a scene that happens when he was 16, and so you've jumped back in time and shown that, and so that would be non-chronological. That's an example that we'll get to a little bit later. But most other books, No Country for Old Men, The Road, both by Cormac McCarthy, those are all in chronological order because it's the easiest. It's the easiest. Doesn't mean that it's easy. I just said that it was the easiest. It's the most traditional. Most of our brains are hardwired to think in chronological order. So when we get things that are, it's fascinating because our brains don't think chronologically, but they want to assemble everything chronologically. For example, if you walk outside in the rain and you smell the rain on the pavement, immediately you're 7 years old in second grade and you remember the time you first smelled that, right? You didn't have to think backward until you were 7 again. It's an instantaneous connective relational response that we have non-chronologically in our brains, but then if we read something that's non-chronological, our brain wants to reassemble it into chronological order. And that's one of the advantages that we'll talk about later of using a non-chronological structure. But let's stick with chronological first.
Before you go on, though, I got to make this comment because you mentioned Cormac McCarthy. I got a little news blurb over my phone. I get these little news alerts with that, and the alert was that the famous author Cormac McCarthy had died at I forget what the age is, 82 or something like that. And I thought, boy, Aaron's going to be upset to hear that. Half an hour later, I get another little news blurb. Turns out he's not dead. He's alive.
Oh.
Yeah, it was a bad report. Maybe it was a joke or something. I don't know that someone played. But anyway, McCarthy's publicist said, "No, I just talked to him." So, as Mark Twain said, the rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. So as soon as you said that, I thought, he's had a rough day.
Wow.
I used to follow or listen to a band called Tool, and their lead singer was named Maynard, and he was a dyed-in-the-wool atheist, just the biggest atheist you can find, and very adamant against all sorts of religion. And I'd heard on the radio one day that he had found Jesus, and I thought, well, that's really exciting. That's really cool. And so I went to find the news report, and of course it was April 1st. And so he had found a homeless man named Jesus living under a bridge. And okay, well, thank you for that.
Anyway, I just thought you'd like to know that one of your favorite authors had a rough day.
I guess
apparently
so.
He's okay. So,
his day wasn't that bad. People thought he was dead. He's not. That turns out decent day. So, I
shouldn't say this, but I'm just thinking in my case, they'll say Al Gansky died, but no one noticed.
Yeah, that's my fear. Aaron died. We found him 22 years later. All right. Moving on. So chronological structure. You've chosen to use this structure. One of the main points I want to make is make a choice. When you're telling a story, make a choice. How are you going to tell this? If you've got a compelling reason to tell it non-chronologically, go for it. If you don't, it's probably best to stick with chronological structure. Now, I said it's the easiest. It doesn't mean it's necessarily easy. Some things you need to make sure that you're doing, in all cases, but especially in chronological structure, you need to make sure the order of events is clear, the passage of time. Okay? So when your main character falls asleep on page 17 and wakes up on page 18, I need to know that only one night has passed. Otherwise, if we're Rip Van Winkle, we need to know he falls asleep on page 17, and when he wakes up on page 18, he's got a beard that goes down to his toes. So now, okay, the passage of time is clear. Establish your setting and be sure it's consistent. Somebody's phone going off there?
Yeah, it's my phone. It's me.
Oh, my goodness.
And all my iPads are going off with it, and I'm trying to kill it. There we go.
Yeah. So establish your setting and make sure that it's consistent as well. One of the downfalls of fiction is people not establishing clearly their setting. And remember, setting includes time as well as place. You want to look for inconsistencies. And I just finished what I call a consistency draft of the work that I'm currently, the novel that I'm currently finishing up. And what that is for me is, since I'm a discovery writer, I go through and I write it, and since I'm not sitting down reading or writing it all at one time, sometimes I make mistakes. In the first Hand of Adonai, or actually I think in the second Hand of Adonai book, which comes out August 15th, by the way, I had a character with a broken sword that was 2 scenes later fighting with a whole sword. Now that's very interesting. I'm not sure how that sword got unbroken, but look at that. Some of my early readers were good enough to catch that mistake. So you want to make sure that that you are being consistent in your chronological structure. Pops?
Yeah, this is known as continuity. It's a really big deal in television and movies, and I think we've all seen this, where they're doing a one shot of a person, and they're at a restaurant and they're having a drink, and you can see what it is. Let's say he's drinking beer or something from a glass. And when they take that shot, the glass is half full or half empty, as you prefer. Then they go to a 2-shot showing the 2 people at the table, and the glass is now full. And then they go to a different close-up from a different angle, and the glass is almost empty. And most the directors will have somebody who's just in charge of that, making sure that everything is the same. So if the character's wearing a blue shirt, it's a blue shirt all the way through that scene. They don't switch to yellow because they're filming at a sequence on a different day or something like that. And we have to do that in books. We make sure that whatever we set up is in the right place and that it follows through in the story. So, and most writers will make some mistake along the line in doing that. It's hard to juggle it all.
It is, and with chronological structure, it's fairly simple because you just read straight through, and then what you find is what you find. Non-chronological can be a little more challenging when you're looking for consistencies. How old were they in this year? Okay. And what did I say? You know, his old brother's name was, or these types of things that might pop up. You've got to make sure that the consistency is still there, and it's tough. So, non-chronological structure refers to stories that are not told as a time-based sequence of events. So if we were to assign a letter to each scene as A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and that's our book, chronologically you would arrange those scenes A, B, C, D, E, F, G. However, in a non-chronological structure, you might mix that up. It might be D, G, A, C, D, F, or something like that.
You forgot B.
Well, no, that's the flashback for later. B is right there at the end. Don't be snide.
Ooh.
Good catch, though. Good catch. And so if you're writing non-chronologically, again, make sure that you've got a reason for it. Don't do it just because it's cool or it's bleeding edge or anything like that. If you're doing it to stretch yourself as a writer, you want to stretch your wings a little bit, try something new, great. I would also say this. Read non-chronological stories if you haven't done them before. Read non-chronological novels. See how they piece themselves together, because there is still a structure. It's not just, I'm going to tell this scene now because I feel like it. I'm going to tell this scene now because I feel like it. There is a particular order, a meticulous ordering of these scenes that is perhaps even more meticulous than what you would get with just a writer who sits down and writes a chronological structure. Pops, you're going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say that the thing to remember is story trumps everything. And sometimes we come across people who they want to do something that is different and avant-garde to show that they have those kinds of skills, and they lose track of the reader. The story is there for the reader. It's not there for the writer. If you just want to do that kind of stuff for your own pleasure, you're probably not going to be publishing it, so it doesn't really matter. Do whatever you want. But if other people are going to be reading it, then you have to make sure that your reader can follow what it is that you're doing. So if your chronology is off, not off, but different, it's not sequential chronology, we're doing a little skipping around here, that's fine if there's a reason for it, and if it serves the story, and most of all, that the reader can follow it. I've seen some where it's just almost impossible to follow, and it's not a pleasure to read anymore. And so usually I don't finish. I move on to something else.
And that is one of the risks that you run with a non-chronological structure. If you're going to be in it, you got to make sure you're doing it well, and you got to make sure that there's a reason for it, and that it's clear, that the passage of time is clear.
The reader will always assume it's chronological until you show them otherwise. So when they start the book, they're going to think that they're going to move through time in a nice orderly manner, and they'll be able to keep track of things. When you do a non-chronological thing, especially if you're doing a bunch of jumping around, which I don't recommend, but if that's what you're doing, the reader will discover that as they move through the book, and it can be confusing. So always keep the reader in mind.
Absolutely. Well said. I lost my place. So the show notes.
Well, let's talk about things like the different strategies for non-chronological, like flashbacks. You mentioned flashbacks a few minutes ago.
Yeah, I actually, you mentioned that strategies, and that's where my mind had gone, and I was scanning through the show notes to see, did I put those in the show notes that I wrote last week? And turns out I don't think I did. So some of the strategies, I think the best way to kind of keep the reader oriented is to start with something as simple as a timestamp. If you're dealing with two different time periods, maybe your first scene is you got November 12th, 1922, and then the next scene is November 12th, 1982, and then the next scene is November 12th, 1962, because we're jumping around at 2-decade periods. Something like that is simple. If you don't want to do that, if you're just writing a short story and you just have a couple scenes, you don't have a lot of chapters, it could be as simple as, at his 14th birthday party, So just a little introductory phrase to begin your sentence. At his 14th birthday party, Sam thought blah, blah, blah. Now the reader is immediately oriented. Well, gee, Sam was just 20 in the last scene, but now we're at his 14th birthday. Got it, and we're moving on. So those are a couple of the strategies that I would use, that I have used in my non-chronological stories when I write those. So
I've seen people just write 2 years earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Once they establish what the primary period of time that you're in for your protagonist, I've seen them just write 2 years earlier, 5 years earlier, just so they get some feeling for it. And readers don't mind that. They'll read that, and it doesn't take them out of the story. They just throw it away, mentally throw that away, so once they know where they are.
Exactly. It's contextual information. It's like the brackets on a stage play that give information. It's like the what do you call it, stage directions or set directions. And yes, it gives them, it orients the reader, and then they just kind of disregard it. It's almost becomes invisible to them, which is what you want, because you want them to stay in the story. So it can be something like the year before he was hired at the fire station, the year before she met her husband, whatever the case is, just something that gets us right in there. We know where we are in context of place and time, and then we're on with the story. So it doesn't take much.
And the thing with non-chronological structure is just like we go through great pains to set the setting so people know where they are and what's going on around them. We set the scene when we talked about scenes. We go through a good bit of work to make that clear. When you're doing things out of order, you need to make the time clear. So that's part of your setting.
Absolutely. So a couple of terms that you may want to be familiar with. Flashbacks are pretty common knowledge if you've been writing or watching movies at all. And this is just simply, it's a very popular way to reveal backstory. Some people love them, some people really don't love them. So if you've got a compelling reason for it, great. Otherwise, sometimes you can just not do a flashback. But a flashback is where you jump backward in time and you show some sort of important event. I would maintain that this event needs to be somehow tied to the present action. You'll hear me use that term, the present action, and that's what the majority of your book is going to be. What is your present action? Most stories that are non-chronological have a present action, and they'll jump and do some flashbacks, and they might jump forward and do some flash forwards. Usually it's just flashbacks, but sometimes they'll do flash forwards. But there's still a present action. They're still telling A, B, C, and D. They just might jump forward and tell Q and V somewhere in between A, B, C, and D. They might jump backward and show, I guess, negative Z, if that works. That's getting confusing. Whatever happened before A, they might also have that scene somewhere in between A, B, C, and D. That would be a flashback. Do not get flashbacks confused with foreshadowing. It's a very common thing to get those two. Flash forwarding. Flash forward is you jump forward in time. A foreshadow is just simply a hint at what might happen. Your character is walking through the woods and they see a footprint that is a size 23 sneaker. Something big is lurking in the forest. They haven't seen it. We haven't jumped forward to the battle with this great Bigfoot, but we do know that something's going to happen, right? As an adult, Marcus would spend much of his time courting blondes. That might be like a foreshadow. Okay, as an adult, that gives us our little clue that, well, when he's older, not right now, because right now he's still a teenager, but as an adult, he's going to spend much of his life. So that's going to orient us for the flash forward. Makes sense?
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah. Now, Pops, you did something like this with The Fog, didn't you?
I did. The Fog being one of the books in the Harbinger series, and for those who are new to the program, the Harbinger series is done by 4 authors, Frank Peretti, Bill Myers, Angie Hunt, and myself. And now Jeff Gerke. Frank Peretti's had to move on to another project. But it's a series of novellas, and we each write from a different perspective, a different character's point of view. And in The Fog, my character, Tank, an ex-football player, is standing on the parapet, the edge of the roof of a 50-story building in downtown San Diego. And Aaron, you happen to be in San Diego.
I do.
Don't get any ideas. And he's about to leap off the edge. And that's how I begin the book. But the last line of that, and I did it as prologue, to take it out of the timeline. And the last line in this is, but before I do, I need to tell you something. And then that's where the story begins. And then in Act 3, we come back to him standing in that same position, about to jump off. Then he jumps off and does what he needs to do with that. So I did that in the fog. And the benefit to doing that from time to time is when the reader knows something dramatic is about to happen, there's this great moment of sacrifice that's going to go on, some great display of courage, and then you deprive them of completing that. You just mentioned it up front, you get to that point, and then you go to what would be, from that perspective, back in time and then run back up to it. It keeps the reader very interested. They have something to look forward to. They know this is going to happen. Why is that scene there? What's going to happen? And so they will read quickly through it. That's one way you get a page turner. They run quickly through it so they can get to that event to find out how that turns out. So it worked. It worked well in the fog. Creepy book that it was.
And that's actually the first non-chronological structure that I wanted to talk about, which is climax, beginning, middle, and end. And you've got a really good setup there with the fog. And what you mentioned was it was the penultimate scene, right? Mm-hmm. This is or the penultimate, the scene right before the climax. Now you're not showing the climax. You're not showing Frodo dropping the ring into the fires of Mordor, but you show him holding the ring over the fires, thinking, debating. And like you say, it's that dramatic moment. And how did we get to this point? Why is there a hobbit with a ring over a big lava pit? Like, what is going on here? Thelma and Louise did this. And I was just at the San Diego Auto Museum and saw the whatever car they were in. There was a T-Bird or something like that. And there they are, Thelma and Louise, in this car, like right in front of the Grand Canyon, and about 36 cop cars coming up behind them. And they're thinking, well, what do we do now? Like, cops behind us, we got the cliff in front of us, and you're thinking, what did these two women do to get that many police chasing them, right? Well, then you jump back to A, and you tell the story A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So if you're ending at G, you don't start with G. You don't start with what happens at the end, because then there's no point in reading. We already know. You go back, you start at F, go back to A, and tell A, B, C, D, E, F. And then you get to G. Then you show what happens at that climax, and then you can wrap it up with your epilogue or whatever else you need to do. The denouement is there. But what it does is it gives them an interesting moment at the beginning. And I think, I don't have this in the show notes, but I think really what you're trying to do is show a juxtaposition between the two. High drama and then normal beginning. And so that juxtaposition plays a point where we want to know what events have happened and in what order have they happened to lead these people to this particular moment. And so that can be an effective way of beginning a story or a novel. So,
especially if your beginning's a little pedestrian, just because of the nature of the story, so it's going to be a little slow. Sometimes putting some action up front that's out of the time sequence can generate a lot of interest in the reader, and they're willing to put up with a little slower entry into the story. We're taught, begin with action. Well, you always begin with some kind of action, but if you want to begin with a bang, but your story doesn't lend itself to starting that way, then sometimes putting something up front will help that out.
Absolutely. Now, I will also say that's something to consider. If your story begins a little pedestrian, maybe consider starting later in the story. Now, that being said, this structure is still good and can be effective, like, for the juxtaposition pops like you set up in the fog. So there are reasons for it, but I think if I wouldn't use this exclusively because your beginning is a little bit weak. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you don't do it because you don't know how to start the book. You do it because the story requires a little slower beginning. So let me give you an example. I did a book a long time ago, and my opening scene was a woman who wakes up at a seedy hotel in the Mojave Desert, and that's her first realization. She's in this seedy motel, and the room is dirty. The second thing is she realizes is that she doesn't know she doesn't remember herself. She can't recognize her own image. She doesn't know how she got there, so she's got some form of amnesia, and she doesn't know what to do. Well, publishers wanted me to set that up. In this case, I wish I hadn't. I wish I just stayed with it, but I did. She quickly learns that she's been in an auto accident. There's just the right kinds of bruises from seatbelts and stuff. And I wish I hadn't written the prologue that way, but I did. I went back and started with the chase that led to the accident, and then chapter 1. Again, I did it as prologue. Then chapter 1, she wakes up uncertain who she is and how she got there. And then, of course, much of the rest of the story is her figuring that out and what kind of danger she's in.
And so there, rather than starting at the penultimate scene or whatever, the moment before the climax, you actually just did prologue and did a moment before, right? So you just went one step back in time, correct?
Yeah, I went back several hours to the night before. Mm-hmm. What I don't explain is how she ends up in the hotel or anything else.
Right.
Just she remembers the chase, and then she wakes up, and that's pretty much it.
That seedy motel, would that be the Econo Lodge? Was that the seedy motel that she woke up in?
Actually, I did base it on a real hotel. It's hard to see it now, but as you travel from the high desert up to Bakersfield, you used to have to go through a small town where they have an airport that specializes in defunct aircraft. But anyway, it's an interesting little town, but there was a little motel there that looked kind of creepy to me, and I thought that'd be perfect for the book. So I stuck her in that motel. She hasn't talked to me anymore, but it made for a good beginning.
Well, she forgot who you were, so
yeah,
it's amnesia. So what do you expect?
That was the book Distant Memory,
which I think had probably your most poignant dedication to date. So we'll just leave it at that. So anyhow, moving on.
You can't introduce it without explaining it.
You dedicated that book to me.
I guess it is poignant.
How much amnesia do you have?
Quite a bit.
You've only written like 50 books. How do you not memorize who you've dedicated them each to?
Yeah. So, it's embarrassing when you can't remember the titles of your own books. So.
Yeah. All right, moving on. Well, the book is called Distant Memory, so moving on. So another chronological, or rather non-chronological structure that you can adopt is a backward story. So this would be told G, F, E, D, C, B, A. I think I got that right. An example of this might be the movie Memento, which actually has a more sophisticated, much more sophisticated chronological structure. It tells the stories of each day in chronological order, but it begins with the last day and then jumps back to the day previous to that and then the day previous to that. So each day is chronological, but when he goes to sleep at night, instead of waking up one day in the future, he wakes up one day in the past. And it's a brilliant structure for the story that's being told, because the guy has short-term memory loss. He can only remember like one day at a time. And so when he wakes up, he's got all these notes, and he's like, what do these notes even mean? And so he spends the day trying to figure out the notes, and then he leaves himself notes at night before he goes to sleep. So it's really kind of an interesting thing. Content warning on it. I haven't seen it in a while. I think it's pretty violent in some language and stuff. But Currents is a great little flash fiction piece by Hannah Bottomy that begins with a man drinking single malt on his porch with the lights out. So clearly something's wrong. And as you go through, we get to see that a boy has died in the waves out on the beach, and it happened kind of close to home, and his daughters were affected because this is the first time they'd seen a dead body, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's one page long, and each paragraph begins with "before that," and then it would say what happened. Before that, it would say what happened, and it moves backward kind of step by step by step. And what I like about it is that I said earlier that our minds like to have everything in chronological order. So when we get to the end of this piece, our mind kind of by default will reorganize the events and tell it in chronological order. So it's almost a way of having this story live on beyond its pages, because our mind is still playing with it when we're done. And I'll give an example of that when we talk about Slaughterhouse-5 too. But the other thing that allows you to do is the final line of the story is, before that, it was a simple summer day. Pops, if I started a story with it was a simple summer day, is that a gripping opening for you?
Let me think about that. Generally, no, but if you can do it with enough mystery as to why that would be important enough to mention, I'd read on to the second or third sentence. But if it doesn't draw me in there, I'm probably moving on.
And when you start a story, it was a bright sunny day. Like, really, come on, like that's the most cliche opening. Other than a dark and stormy night, let's get to something here. But by ending with before that, it was a simple summer day. There's a sense of irony there because we already know now what happens. We understand this boy dies and it's tragically affecting these two young girls, etc. And we get to put all these pieces together. The initial question is, what's happened to this man? And then why are the girls scared? And then all the stuff, and then it starts piecing together very nicely. It's very well done. As a matter of fact, I like that story so much that while I was editing the Citron review, I had somebody submit a story that the other editors loved and I didn't love. And they said, well, we want to run it. And I said, okay, if we run it, then we need to really fix it up. And so I worked with a guy to adopt a backward structure for the story because I thought the story was very slow to get going, and it had a really good payoff at the end, but I thought, let's swap that. And so we started with it backward and started with that more climactic kind of tension at the beginning and had that more sense of kind of that ironic ending. And it seemed to really work well. The author seemed to be very pleased with it. So that's another one for you. Another type is parallel flashbacks or flash forwards. Now, this is different than just a flashback or a flash forward in isolation. The best example that I can think of for this would be Lost. And if you watch that television show, specifically the first season is fantastic. You can skip the others, but the first season, must view. And what's really interesting about this is Lost. I refused to watch it for the entire first season was done before I watched it, and my whole thought process was it's Gilligan's Island 2004. Like, nobody gets lost on an island. Stop it. And once I started watching it, I realized that the writing was really well done. And you'll have a character that's crash landed on an island in 2004, and as their story progresses on the island, there's this other story progressing back home before they got on the plane. And so you get to know these characters and what they were doing before they got on the plane, what led them to that particular plane. More importantly, they were formative events in the lives of the characters that informed a decision that those characters would make on the island that would otherwise not make any sense to the viewer or to the other people on the island. And what I like about that is by the end of each episode, we know that character a lot better than we did at the beginning. And so you get to see kind of this progression of characters because of these parallel flashbacks. So the story would be kind of like you'd have two stories. You'd have 2004, and then the next scene would be 1994, 2004, 1994, 2004, 1994. And it just goes back and forth like that. Until you get to the very end and you find that they have been pieced together intentionally because there's some sort of relationship between the two events or series of events. And that's one that I really like to see. Pops, you did this in A Ship Possessed, right?
Yeah, it's similar, but I call it a DNA structure, and that is there were two stories circling the same axis, not axis. Two stories circling the same axis, and so I had a World War II storyline and I had a contemporary storyline. One MacGuffin was shared. In this case, it was a World War II submarine. One MacGuffin is shared, but we have two sets of characters, and the action revolves around this plot line, and one affects the other. The past affects the present storyline, and the only way the reader can understand what's going on is to know what happened way back then. So kept going back and forth between these two, and I use time stamping to make that clear. Of course, once you understand the characters in each time frame, that's really enough, but I did it for consistency's sake.
Can you define MacGuffin? You used that word
Oh, sure, yeah.
again for
Thanks.
people who don't know?
Yeah, I never like to assume everybody knows the terms, and sometimes I forget to define them. MacGuffin is a term that was coined by Alfred Hitchcock. A MacGuffin is a catalyst. It is a thing, an item, something that drives the story forward but is not the story itself. So the Maltese Falcon, if you ever get a chance to see that old movie with Humphrey Bogart and like, the Maltese Falcon is a MacGuffin. The story really isn't about the Maltese Falcon. It's about the people searching for the Maltese Falcon. So that's what a MacGuffin is. It's the thing that involves all the characters, drives the story forward, but really isn't the story itself. It's about how the story is about how the people respond, what their motivations are, that sort of thing. So Aaron's talking about the television show Lost. The MacGuffin is the island. But the story really isn't about the island. It's about the people who end up on the island, crash on the island. So that's a quick definition of the MacGuffin.
And in A Ship Possessed, it would be the submarine,
Yes.
which is the thing that ties both parties together, both the casts of characters, both time periods together. And the submarine even almost takes on kind of the role of a character. Again, that's one of my favorite books, and if you get a chance to pick that up, A Ship Possessed, you definitely guys do yourselves a favor, pick that up.
Well, thanks. Raiders of the Lost Ark's another one, where the Ark of the Covenant is the MacGuffin.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody knows what they're after, what the Nazis are after, and what our heroes are after. But the story isn't really about the Ark of the Covenant. It's about Indiana Jones and everything he goes through to make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. So that's, again, a MacGuffin. That's what they're chasing, but it isn't the story.
And I guess while we're talking about non-chronological structures, one that I forgot to mention was chiastic structure, which is a mirroring of things. And Lost, while we're talking about it, mirrored itself. So Season 1 asked questions that Season 6 answered. Season 2 asked questions that Season 5 answered. Season 3 and Season 4 likewise. And so it kind of mirrored each other. And what was interesting about that is I think in Season 3, Lost actually started doing flash forwards, parallel flash forwards, rather than flashbacks. I think they did that Season 3 and Season 4. And then by the time you get to 6, they went off the rails. So it was a little bit. So oh my goodness, that final episode. We need to do a podcast on how Lost blew the ending, but we're going. We're plowing forward. We should have talked about that when we talked about endings, but here we go. Another chronological or non-chronological structure here, and this is the most loosey-goosey one. Loosey-goosey is time jumping. I couldn't think of a fancy term for it, so I just called it time jumping. This is completely non-chronological. This is A, D, Q, F, C, B, L, R squared, and yay. I don't know. There's like a double L in there someplace, but these have to really be done very, very well. They move fluidly through time. They bounce between present action, flashbacks, and often flash forwards. Some examples for you that you may or may not be familiar with. One of my favorite stories, Water Walkers by Brett Anthony Johnston, which is in his collection Corpus Christi, and many of the other stories in Corpus Christi. I've analyzed them because I'm that big of a nerd. Use this time jumping kind of a structure as well for a particular reason, which I'll talk about as we get further on here. The Prophet from Jupiter by Tony Early, which I'll give you a content warning on that one. And then, of course, Slaughterhouse-5, also a content warning, but by Kurt Vonnegut Jr., which is a novel-length one, and you talk about moving fluidly through time. This guy's jumping backward, forward, left, and right, and he's got aliens that look like plungers called Tralfamadorians. So, what's not to love in that book? It's fantastic. I mean, what World War II book is complete without plunger-shaped aliens, right? So,
well, you couldn't write one.
You couldn't write one.
Okay.
So they were so instrumental in the outcome of World War II.
Someplace there's an editor going, I'd buy this, but where are the plunger-shaped aliens?
Exactly. Yeah. I'm going to say that next time I'm looking at a manuscript. I'll just be like, where are the plunger-shaped aliens? Rewrite this. So I need Noah's in the Ark with plunger-shaped aliens. All right. So these move fluidly through time, bounce between present action and flashbacks and flash forwards. They got to be handled delicately. This is where you're really going to be stretching yourself in terms of establishing the time period, when he was 11, or the summer he got sick, or before Harry met Sally, or whatever it is. These types of things, you've got to make sure that those are all in order and very clear. There's usually some sort of connection between them. Okay, so what happens in A is, ends with the smell of the rain, and the next one is he'd smelled the rain on pavement for the first time when he was 7 years old, and he, was hanging out with Billy Smith, and Billy Smith, blah, 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 whatever it is. So there's some sort of connection from this scene that leads to the next scene. Not always, but usually.
The old television show Kung Fu did that. The main character is a kung fu expert. He's a monk that's running away from a false murder charge. But and he's in the Wild West now. He'll encounter something that will remind him of his training back in China. So, and that was part of every episode, at least once, usually a couple times.
And so there's precedence for this. Perhaps the most disjointed story I've read in terms of time is The Prophet from Jupiter. And it's intriguing because he'll have a single paragraph that talks about 4 different time periods. He's got like 4 different timelines going, and he talks about events in each one, and he just jumps between all of them. It seems very confusing when you map it out and look at it on paper, but reading it, he does it so deftly that you understand. Before they drained the lake, blah, 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 blah. When they built the dam, blah, 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 blah. These types of things, just enough to give us a setting, contextual setting for when we are and where we are, and he does it seamlessly. I've had other people read it and not be so thrilled with it. They've said it's not that great, but I think it is, and I think especially if you've read it once or if you've read it 2 or 3 times, and you start to get a sense for what he's actually doing and how he's pulling it off, it's pretty incredible. Water Walkers, and I can't speak to why he's Brett Anthony Johnson wrote it non-chronologically, but I have a feeling that it has to do with how he ends the story. So I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler alert here, and that is it centers around a couple that's been divorced, and they were divorced because their son died, their young son died, and they couldn't recover, and so the present action is these two coming back together, not necessarily making amends, not necessarily getting back together, but they end up together again for a short time. And the question is this going to turn into something? Can they rekindle what they once had, etc.? Well, it keeps going back into the past to their marriage to talk about these particular events. And the reason he adopted this non-chronological structure is because instead of ending in the present action, he ends in the past, with a scene in which mom and dad are on a boat with their son, and everybody is happy, and everything is good. And so it kind of gives this hopeful feeling that maybe they're going to get back together in the present action. Maybe they're going to rekindle this love. Maybe they can be a family again, even after this tragic event in their life. But just very, very well done. Slaughterhouse-Five is very disjointed, very easy to understand, though. It's very easy to track and read, like you never feel confused. But the point of it is that the point of Kurt Vonnegut writing the book is that war is senseless. It makes no sense. Hence, plunger-shaped aliens. Why? It doesn't make sense. Yes, that's the point. This is what war is. It's plunger-shaped aliens. It makes no sense. Now, of course, that's a very base kind of interpretation of it, and the book is a lot more deep than that. But it's fascinating to read and analyze, and to see how he puts it together. And he even says in chapter 1 that he tried to write it chronologically and he couldn't. Why is it non-chronological? Because war doesn't make sense. That's the only way his mind could allow him to write the book about war, is it doesn't make sense. So here's a book that it's very fascinating to read. I don't know if you could tell, but it's one of my favorite books. I've read it 36 times. It's might be an illness. I haven't consulted my doctor. I've been afraid to ask, but
So
just
you have a
really.
plunger-shaped alien addiction, huh?
Yeah, my therapist is also a Tralfamadorian, which they can see in 5 dimensions, I think it is. So um, it's really well done. But again, there is an example of um, structure serving story rather than story serving structure. Please don't write a story just because you want it to be non-chronological. Write a story, and if it needs to be told non-chronologically, that's what you're going to do. If you need a flashback, you put a flashback in. If you don't need it, you take it out. But with everything with fiction, and you've heard us say this before, and I'll say it again, I just want you to be intentional with what you're doing and how you do it. Make sure that you're making these choices on purpose and that you're not just doing things because it sounds nifty. So, Pops, did you have anything else?
No, boy, and our time's gone too.
It went
Time
fast.
flies when you're fast forwarding and jumping through time.
We should have done this backward. We should have just recorded it and just played it back. Molly, do we have any comments or questions from the room?
Well, it was a pretty quiet room. We had Bruce Brady in there listening.
Hi,
Hey, Bruce.
Marie Bass listening.
Hey.
Marie said, thanks for explaining what a MacGuffin was. She'd never heard the term, so thanks for that.
I like a nice blueberry MacGuffin.
Okay.
Never mind, just move on. Nothing to see here.
Becky Lindsay said she decided to make a major change in her young adult novel since attending the Blue Ridge Conference. She has 14 characters. The first chapter was all backstory of an event when each girl was 6 years old. Chapter 2 started 11 years later. She now starts Chapter 1 in present time, but is weaving bits of the past in flashbacks. The thing is, she says she really liked the first chapter the way it was. She's thinking she could have shortened the first chapter when they were 6 and still weave in some flashbacks later. Now she's confused and doesn't know what to do. I told her that there really isn't any particular right way, just as long as the story moves forward. I've read her story. I'm editing her story. It's really good. I suggested maybe a prologue, but I forgot, and she reminded me she already has a prologue with the Angels and Demons. It's a spiritual warfare book, sort of along Frank Peretti's Present Darkness. It's really, really a good book. So should she start with current time and do flashbacks, or should she start when they're 6 and then Chapter 2 starts 11 years later?
I lean towards starting present time and reveal slowly. I think one of the best writing techniques is to reveal information slowly.
I agree. Yeah, I agree with that. I do. Reveal only that which is absolutely necessary, and then also ask yourself the question, does it have to be in a flashback, or is this some information that's going to come to light otherwise? And so you can do a lot with kind of remembering things, perhaps one character telling another character something else. There are some natural ways to get some of that information out there. We tend to think that the reader needs all of the information, and the reader doesn't. The reader just needs some pieces. Also, I'm glad I went back and read this comment in the room, because when you first started reading it, I thought 14 characters is too much. That's way too many. Like, can you cut it down to 13 or to 12? That's way too many characters. And then I went, oh, no, 4 teenage characters. That makes sense.
Oh, yeah. I suppose I should practice my speaking skills a little better.
Well, I didn't catch it. But then again, I'm old, so.
Characters in the book, and 3 of them are named Aaron and Al and Molly, and, they're the crazy ones. Bruce Brady popped in, and he says, if we play this episode backward, we will discover that Paul shot Ringo.
Bum, bum, bum.
Thank you, Bruce.
Well played. Well played. So, excellent. Well, it's been a good cast. We thank you all for listening. Next week is a new month. It's July, and so our topic is going to be switching to point of view, and we'll be talking about first-person point of view next week. So, looking forward to that. The show notes and the audio will probably not be up tomorrow morning as they normally are. Probably tomorrow night, or realistically, Thursday morning is when those will come out. So.
And why is that, Aaron?
I am in San Diego with my family. If you couldn't tell from my different background, I'm in a hotel room doing this via my hotspot on my mobile phone. So good times. Taking up all my data. That's what I do for you guys. That's what I do.
Nice.
So first person next week. Don't forget to ask the author. Got a couple more questions via Facebook lately, but always room for more. And if you're looking for us, you can find us at altongansky.com, frankly-mydearmojo.com, and aarongansky.com. So we thank you all for listening, and until next week, good writing.